Inflation is not a coincidence, it's a policy, and we need to understand that the current path of disinflation is completely unacceptable. Many central banks are talking about the victory on inflation. However, this is far from reality. Not only far from reality for the pockets of any of you watching, but far from reality in the data that they look at in every sense. Let's look at the PCE index that the Fed allegedly considers its most important driver for decisions on policy making. Okay, fair enough. So if we look at the PCE index, what we can see is that in the past 9 months, there's been absolutely no real disinflation in most of the items. In fact, if there's been an item that has driven the process of reduction in inflation, it has been energy. In this graph, courtesy of Bloomberg, what we can see is that there is a very dangerous trend as well. If we look at the services and the non-durable goods elements, there's a huge discrepancy. Services inflation remains not just elevated, but stubbornly elevated, and this is definitely destroying the purchasing power of citizens. Let's look at the next graph, which goes further into the details of the PCE index. This is the core PCE index, so stripping out the effect of energy and food. And this is important because a lot of the narrative comes from the idea that policymakers have been very, very aggressive when it comes to reducing inflation. However, let's remind that the Federal Reserve has been exceedingly lax when it's about policy. Number one, they have prioritized liquidity injections so that the Treasury could not find itself in the difficult position that they would be, considering the completely incoherent deficit and spending policy that is destroying the public finances of the United States. Furthermore, central banks have been a lot more accommodative than one would have expected with such a burst of inflation, because inflation is accommodative. It's insane that in 2024, when supply chain disruptions, commodity, war impacts, all these things that they said were the cause of inflation, which obviously they weren't, but all of those are behind us. We should be in disinflation of no question whatsoever. We should be in a process of reduction of prices that was clearly benefiting citizens. However, what we are seeing is persistent inflation, i.e., accumulated inflation is 20.4%. In the core PCE index, what we can see is precisely that, is how the services inflation is completely out of control, is that durable goods inflation is also out of control, and that all of those elements are negative for the pocket of the average citizen. Inflation is a policy. What benefits, who benefits from inflation? The one who benefits from inflation is the government, because it's issuing more currency and it's presenting itself as a solution. Harris is now talking about fighting corporations for price gouging, which is ridiculous. The only thing that makes prices rise, consolidate, and continue to rise is more currency printing via government spending. And this is the evidence. The evidence is that there's been no disinflation whatsoever in the past 6 months in the United States, in a process in which the Federal Reserve is talking about a great progress and success in fighting against inflation. Let's go to the next graph, also courtesy of Bloomberg, that explains what has happened. Here is gold relative to commodities and relative to oil. What you can see is that oil prices and commodity prices have set a bottom, and the disinflation impact of energy is behind us. therefore, the risk right now is that what we can see is that core inflation remains stubbornly elevated, and at the same time, the energy component is not working as a disinflationary factor. All of those things are important because the bottom in commodity prices also happened with the beginning of rate cuts. And that obviously is a negative, a possibly negative effect in the next few months. Let's pay attention to it. The other thing that we see is gold continues to rocket. Bitcoin is almost close to all-time highs. All those elements are showing that the market is discounting more monetary destruction and therefore persistent inflation. Let's go to the next graph, also courtesy of Bloomberg, which explains what has happened in terms of the inflation expectations of the market. This is how much the expectations of rate cuts have changed in less than a month. Insane. In September 30, market participants expected a path of rate cuts that would take them to 200 basis points by December 25. Okay. By October 31st, what we have seen is that the path of reduction of rates has been destroyed, and now the market is expecting almost half of what markets were expecting just a month ago. This is incredible. This is incredible because what it's showing is that the market does not believe the Fed. It's logical then that bond yields are soaring. It's logical then to see how bond investors are not buying into the disinflation narrative. Because what this is showing is that the market starts to recognize that the Fed is not going to combat inflation the way that it should, i.e. really reducing the amount of money in the system and really managing rates in a way that reduce the increase of new units of currency in the system. It doesn't matter either, because what the market is also discounting is that the Treasury will continue to destroy the currency via government spending and money printing. So, let's go to the other side of the world with the Chinese economy. What is happening with the Chinese economy? The Chinese economy will grow in 2024, 2025 between 4.5 and 5%. But the challenges of the housing market are not over. They continue to be phenomenal, and it's very difficult to address them in the way that Keynesian economists want them to address them. Many economists are demanding that the Chinese government implements more spending policies and more debt increases. However, that doesn't work to start with, because the housing market challenges come precisely from those excessive stimulus packages. If we look at this graph, courtesy of JP Morgan, what we can see is that the housing market activity index is down while the housing policy index is rising, i.e. the housing policy support in order to make it more easy for citizens to purchase a home and to reduce the enormous excessive supply of real estate in the Chinese economy is rising and improving, and the government is doing all it can with supply-side measures. However, the housing market activity index continues to be subdued, but it may be bottoming out, which doesn't mean that it's increasing or getting better rapidly, but it's an important bottom that we need to pay attention to. Let's go to the next graph, which shows us more about China. Absolutely, there is an enormous challenge in the real estate sector. However, when we look at both the services sector and the manufacturing sector and the composite PMI, Purchasing Manager Index, what we can see is that the Chinese economy is in expansion. It may not be expanding as rapidly and as strongly as some would have wanted, but it is going to be the only economy that will absorb the enormous challenges of an enormous, gigantic real estate bubble with decent, not decent but extremely positive levels of growth. So that is something to look at and something to consider. The only economy that we have seen in the past 3 decades that will absorb a real estate bubble of this magnitude with growth. Let's go to the next graph, which is also important. In this one, what we can see is that part of the weakness of the Chinese economy is external, has nothing to do with China itself, but with the weakness of Germany and the weakness of the euro area, big markets for their exports, but also the weakness of the manufacturing sector globally. And this is pretty evident considering that their exports basically track almost to a T the movement in the global manufacturing PMI. And that is also evidence of how poor the result of the stimulus packages has been. The manufacturing sector continues to be exceedingly weak all over the world. Let's go to the next graph, which tells us why there's a little bit of hope in the Chinese economy and the real estate market. Yes, according to Bloomberg, China home sales rise for the first time this year. It's been an absolutely atrocious couple of years since 2022. However, we need to pay attention to this slight bounce in home sales and pay attention to it because it may be misleading considering what happened in January to April of 2023 when home sales also rose and then declined back. So it may be the start of an improvement in the trend, but we need to have more than 1 month of positive figures that would dictate a different perspective about the situation of the real estate market, i.e. the Chinese economy will continue to grow, but the challenges of both the export and the real estate sector continue to be phenomenal. So, on the one hand, in the United States, the inflation problem remains the #1 problem for Americans. 20.4% accumulated inflation in 4 years, persistent inflation, Federal Reserve continuing with a rate cut path that is inconsistent with the reality of inflation, but it is also very dangerous for the level of fiscal irresponsibility of the government. And in China, a government that is taking supply-side measures to offset the impact of the real estate sector in an economy that is growing, that is expanding, but that faces 2 phenomenal challenges: the real estate sector and the global manufacturing weakness. Keep defending freedom.
Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to my channel, like my videos, leave your comments below, and keep defending freedom. Thank you very much.